there are imbalances in the world that I live in. There are problems. They're asking such questions as, why does discrimination exist? Why are some people poor and others not poor, and others even rich? Things like that. Asking questions about power, asking questions about society. That's the personal connection for me. But more specifically, I think the connection to Black theology and all of these questions of justice and the social order um, come from an attempt to puzzle through whether it is possible to change the way things are. And so it's in fact a dual concern, partly to try and think about, try and understand the world I find myself in, and partly to try and see if it's possible to change and how it may be possible to change the world I'm in. But
Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everybody. Welcome back to another episode on Conversations with Pastor Cliff. And today I have a lovely guest. His name is Silake Singata. It's a friend of mine. We went to the seminary together, but he was, ahead of me when I, first went into the seminary. And today he's based at the University of South Africa. Silake, welcome to Puluso Ministries.
Oh, thanks a lot, Pastor Cliff. Excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Silake, I know you and I kind of kept debated by, liberation theology, Black liberation theology specifically, in the context of South Africa. So that basically, our topic for today, just for our audience to follow, what we are actually, diving into. Perhaps before we talk about this, theology framework, I want us to, perhaps you can introduce yourself to our audience, just tell us what has gotten you into this work, and what kind of inspired you to take up this role in Black liberation theology.
Okay, so Silake Singata is the name. How my story kind of begins is, I went to Helderberg College to study theology, to be a pastor, but realized as I was at Helderberg College that I was very much interested in academic theology. So I did pastor for a brief moment of about 4 years, and then I found myself at the University of South Africa. I must say, however, as a disclaimer, that I'm not like permanently employed by the University of South Africa. I'm on contract as a junior lecturer, so in systematic theology. And then maybe on the more intellectual side of things, my background is, I began, I think, with this intense fascination with the historical Jesus. So there was this whole historical Jesus, obsession phase of my life when I was at Helderberg College, and a little bit afterwards, reading a lot of what the New Testament scholars were saying about the historical Jesus. And that got me, into questions about justice, because it became clear from what I read about the historical Jesus and reading the Synoptic Gospels that Jesus was, all about questions of justice. And to cut a long story short, I found myself reading radical theology, particularly John Caputo. And then soon after that, I found myself reading I Write What I Like, Steve Biko's articles and papers. And that and all of those things, together have led me to a point where I have started engaging Black theology, South African Black theology, more specifically. So I never know whether to think of myself as a Black theologian or to think of myself as someone who engages Black theology. Oftentimes, I'll pick the latter, someone who engages Black theology, but really, I think where the wheels are turning for me in terms of what brings me to an encounter with Black theology is this triangulation of an interest in, the historical Jesus, an interest in radical theology, and an interest in Black consciousness. So then that all of those things together sort of lead me to a point where Black theology in South Africa is perhaps a very important interlocutor. I hope that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yeah, it does. It does actually. You mentioned something quite interesting about the historical Jesus. Maybe some of our viewers may not understand what you mean by the historical Jesus.
Okay.
Do you mind to flesh out what you mean by that?
Okay. Yeah, no, I think briefly I can say historical Jesus studies is this branch of New Testament studies, which basically does this historiographical attempt to reconstruct, I would say construct, but let's say reconstruct the person behind the text of the New Testament. So the New Testament gives us and a picture of Jesus that is mediated by the community of early Christianity, mediated by a very early conglomeration of strains of Christian tradition. But historical Jesus studies tries to get behind that text because there are points where you can sort of see theological tradition being built around the memory of this historical figure. So historical Jesus studies tries to get behind the confessional claims that the New Testament gives us, to look at who the man is, whose memory that these claims in some sense keep alive, and in other cases
Uh,
can, as New Testament scholars would say, can kind of distort. So that's, I don't know if that works as a summary, but I'd give that as a
yeah,
summary.
I think it does. I think it does, Sileke. And now tell me, you've done extensive work in the field of theology. You've published quite a few articles that I've gotten my hands on. And tell me, how do you now define Black liberation theology, and why do you think it's important, particularly for our context here in South Africa?
Yeah, so Black theology, very difficult to define concisely, but let's see if we can do that. Black theology as a phenomenon, first of all, has several different manifestations, and the most easy way to demarcate that is based on where you're talking about that Black theology geographically. So there's the United States version of Black theology, which is the earliest, but then there's also the South African Black theology. Then we also have Black theology in the UK, for example, to take just three examples. But I would say I'm also aware that there are people who would argue that um, the formal emergence of Black theology as a theological discourse is not when Black theology begins. Some people would say from the moment that Black people, let's take the South African context, encounter missionaries and try to think about God in the light of that encounter, they're already in some sense doing Black theology. Others would push it back further and say even before Christianity and the missionaries. But very concisely put, Black theology tries to talk about God in the light of the experience of being in the world as a Black person, or in the light of the challenges that come with being Black, particularly in modernity. So and it is a form of liberation theology, basically. So yeah.
Ah, that's fascinating, Silake. You seem to be drawn in your work into the works of justice, eschatology, social theology, and how do these interest you? Perhaps in terms of you understanding Black liberation theology, how do you try and synthesize them in your work? Because I've seen you touch on those themes quite significantly in your work.
Yeah. So I would say the personal interest for me comes from looking at the world I live in and realizing there are things about it that aren't right, or things about it that there are imbalances in the world that I live in. There are problems. They're asking such questions as, why does discrimination exist? Why are some people poor and others not poor, and others even rich? Things like that. Asking questions about power, asking questions about society. That's the personal connection for me. But more specifically, I think the connection to Black theology and all of these questions of justice and, the social order, um, come from an attempt to puzzle through whether it is possible to change the way things are. And so it's in fact a dual concern, partly to try and think about, try and understand the world I find myself in, and partly to try and see if it's possible to change, and how it may be possible to change the world I'm in. But all of that for me, and the reason I'm not doing something else like sociology or political studies, but specifically theology, is I can describe it as saying theology is my mother tongue. It's the way I frame things. It's the way I think. And so in trying to grapple with these two things, trying to understand my world and trying to ponder about changing it, I do so in a theological register. Theology is not an instrument I use to interact with the world. It is the only mediation I really have, which speaks to my soul about how to, interact with the world I find myself in. So that's the connection. That's the personal connection to these questions that I find myself straddling, whether it's through written outputs or just conversations I have in academic circles.
Yeah, you know, that's interesting that you mentioned that. I know you and I come more or less from the same tradition, in the Adventist circle. And you've penned an article, Adventism in the world, towards the solidarity. The term solidarity, you use it quite extensively, and in your theme, particularly in your article. So how does this concept intersect with Black liberation theology, and what implications does it have in the society, and how it transforms the society ultimately?
Yeah. Okay. So that one, maybe first as a disclaimer, that was something I wrote soon after my undergrad years, just before I even got my honors degree. And it was never published. I had actually written it for a conference that never happened. And then there was another conference and I got a chance to present it at. So my thinking has probably moved a lot since when I penned that. But I can say that, and maybe this will come into answering the question, where that particular paper came from was me trying to look at it, was me grappling with my Seventh-day Adventist context. So I'm from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, still in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, still a member in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, still go to church, all of that. And that paper was me trying to grapple with the Seventh-day Adventist churches, particularly in South Africa, troubling history of race, and its troubling relationship with colonialism on the one hand, and with apartheid on the other hand, and coming out in the post 1994 moment, and realizing how that very troubling history still colors the way that the church sort of still functions. So that article, that paper draws on this notion of solidarity, because what I looked at and saw was, if you read that paper, I was basically showing how there's deep racial division in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but it doesn't begin in the contemporary time, but goes all the way back, and it still exists at present, where some conferences don't want to merge, but the traditional lines of division were racial, things like that, or how the church will have I've never seen, maybe it happens, but I've never seen. I've seen a white pastor pastor black churches in my church in South Africa, but I've never seen a black pastor pastor white churches. Things like that, or refusal for congregations to come together in a substantially mixed racial way. So the question of solidarity in that paper was sort of trying to push for that kind of thing. Can people of two different races come together in this denomination? That's what it was about. I must say though that my thinking has probably, I don't know if I haven't read that paper in such a long time. I don't know if maybe I still agree with everything I said there, but my thinking has sort of even sort of gravitated away from what I was even trying to do there. I think to some extent, not to sound like a pessimist, I think I probably sort of gave up on the church being able to get its act together when it comes to race. I sort of gave up on that, and I think I sort of tried to end up exploring the question outside of even the confines of the Adventist question. So I threw a lot at you there. So we'll see what you pick up from that.
You actually did. But do you think at some point that the church may come together? This whole issue of race seems to be a very contentious issue, particularly in church. I'm not too sure if it's something that the church can overcome. I certainly have those sentiments as well, but I think there's a lot of work that can be done. But I'm not too sure if it's something that will probably be eradicated, maybe in my lifetime or the next generation. I don't know what your take on that.
Yeah, so my take on that is probably pretty depressing. So recently, like maybe in the past like 4 years or so, I've come across Afro-pessimism and Black nihilism, these two very interconnected ways of thinking through the issues of race, which originate from North America. And I must say that basically they have this notion, they agree on the notion that the issue of anti-Blackness is not something that will be overcome within modernity. And I found that argument compelling. But coming to your question about the church specifically, I'm pretty convinced that Seventh-day Adventism, my church, which I belong to and have no intention of leaving, is deeply connected to and deeply modernist. It is a Western modernist way of being a Christian. And I don't mean that as an insult. I'm just being descriptive. I'm just trying to describe what I see. And insofar as it is implicated by modernity, I don't think it can overcome the problem of racism. Just as I don't think anything that is substantially modernist will be able to get over the race question. There's a reason why I think that, but maybe we can talk about that later. There's a reason why I agree with the notion that anti-Blackness racism can't be overcome within a modernist lexicon or a modernist discursive and conceptual universe. But the short answer to your question is I don't think, so long as we're connected in the ways that we are with modernity, I don't think the Seventh-day Adventist Church will make progress with the question of race.
Well, I share the same sentiments, but it's not about me today. It's you, telling me about your work. But tell me, you write a lot about John Caputo in the whole notion of eschatology. Now tell me, you touch on this whole futuristic notion of transformation in your theme, particularly in John Caputo's work, as you extract from that. So how do you see this eschatological hope contributing to the struggle of liberation, particularly in our context here in South Africa?
Yes, very good question. I think the question you're asking here is the question when I was doing my master's. I went into my master's trying to grapple with that question, and I came out on the other side without an answer. So, so I guess it'll take many years before I even can answer that question. But let me just
Yeah.
throw a few things at you that I think can probably take the form of taking of the question seriously.
Yeah.
I think my reason for so let me say biographically, it was reading John D. Caputo that sort of opened me up a little bit theologically. That was my encounter with deconstruction, this philosophical
Hmm.
notion that sort of comes from the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. It was reading that opened me up theologically. But after reading what he says, particularly in a book of his called The Weakness of God, that book sort of pushed me to grapple with my own context, because that's the effect reading that book had on me. So that's when I ran to Steve Biko after reading that book to sort of grapple with my own context. And when I read Biko, and this will connect to eschatology and Black theology and liberation. When I read Biko and his articulation of Black consciousness, in two different places, in two different essays, the most famous of which is one that originally appeared in the first journal of Black theology, or the first collection of Black theology works. He describes Black consciousness dialectically, in Hegelian terms, where you've got this thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and he paints a picture of history as something that progresses through dialectical movement. So a dialectic basically means contradiction. So there's a thesis, and for Biko, the thesis is white supremacy, apartheid,
Hmm.
colonialism. Then there's an
Yeah.
antithesis which contradicts the thesis, and for Biko, that is Black solidarity, Black consciousness. But then what this does is these two contradictory things encounter each other, um, they basically cause a clash, which results in a third thing, which isn't the white supremacy, which isn't the thrust of the Black solidarity / Black consciousness, but is a third thing, a synthesis, which Biko called true humanity. So Biko looks at South African history as something that's going to progress through contradiction and land up in a point where we have true humanity, which is something more universal, which is a better relationship between Black and white people, etc., etc. And Black theology, what people don't know is this: one of the sources that Steve Biko had in as he developed his articulation of Black theology was James Cone.
Sure.
James Cone, the first person to formally talk about Black
Mm.
theology as Black theology, at least as we know it today. So, and that also sort of is connected to the development of Black theology in the late 60s and early 70s in South Africa. Um,
Mhm.
but that tells me that in the project of Black theology in South Africa, there is this historical progressive vision, this movement
Mhm.
towards a particular future, which in theological terms is eschatology.
Yeah.
There's a vision of this movement to a particular vision of the future. But what I found when I read a lot of pre 1994, apartheid era Black theology, is that nobody actually wrote an eschatology in Black theology. People tended to focus on the questions of theological anthropology,
Mhm.
or questions of the Christology, the doctrine of Christ, Black
Mhm.
Christology, or even questions of Black theology and the Bible and the use of the Bible, biblical
Mhm.
hermeneutics. But
Sure.
nobody really focused on the question of the future. Nobody really focused on the question of eschatology. But very clearly and explicitly, no matter who you read, there was definitely this vision. It's something that Black theology gets from Black consciousness. and Black consciousness nourishes through Black theology, because Black theology and Black consciousness in this period sort of have a symbiotic relationship. They sort of mutually support each other. But nobody really fleshes out this eschatology. So I came in with my master's sort of out of my encounter with Caputo, being critical of Hegelian dialectical thinking and Marxist dialectical thinking, only to look and find, and by the way, that critique is basically a critique of the myth of progress. I don't believe in the notion that history dialectically moves in the direction of progress. But then to discover that taking that belief put me in contradiction with Black theology, at least with the Black theology deeply articulates its own vision of the future within the dialectical strategies that I am saying I disagree with. So my master's was a way of trying to say, what can I take from Black theology, and even after my critique or my agreement with the critique of dialectical thinking. So that for me resulted in questions about the future, which move away from progressivist thinking. That's a bad summary of what I did there, but the precise one I can come up with now.
Yeah, but I like that. But some people may say, if we don't believe in progress, then can I eradicate, our hope or in future eschatology, as you mentioned it. But now, you also piece something that I think I want to, just latch into that. The justice for the dead. I mean, that's your article that you delve into. And this whole notion of justice, which is also quite strong in Black liberation theology. So perhaps if you could just discuss how, addressing the past injustices currently inform how we look towards, liberation and equality in where we find ourselves. Are we talking about the past, and also how does that past down affect the future in terms of how do we address, all these things that have happened in the past and rectify some of these things, if we can rectify.
Yeah, so that article is my first ever peer-reviewed published article, and I don't have a lot. I mean, I'm pretty new to this academia thing, but that one I think anticipates. Because I wrote that before I even knew there was such a thing as Black nihilism or Afro-pessimism, but I think to some extent that article anticipates my move to the sort of discursive universe of Black nihilism, But to really answer your question about how do we think about justice, at least in that article, what are my reflections on the question of justice and the question of reparations for past injustices? So I think a central or crucial concept in that article is the notion of irreparable loss and ruined time, somewhere in I think the first section of that article or so. And in a nutshell, what that refers to is the idea that, number one, the atrocities of history are not things that happened so that we could be stronger and better. You know how we talk about how with all of these stories, these biographies that you read about people who became successful and who can say growing up without parents is part of the reason why I grew up to be a hard worker and became rich and successful or whatever, or things, etc., etc., etc. But the notion of irreparable loss says, but let's look at the fact that there are historical tragedies that didn't lead to a better future. They are just tragedy, pure and simple. They didn't create, they didn't make us stronger, they didn't make us better. They are nothing but loss. They are nothing but pain, nothing but tragedy. And there's a way in which there has been no repair for them, and there can be no repair for them. So this is to say, for example, let's take the Holocaust in Germany. Whatever reparations the Germans did didn't bring back the dead. It didn't undo the loss, or even if we talk about our own South African context, whatever was negotiated in the early 90s doesn't undo what was done by colonialism and apartheid. And I don't think, even if those negotiations went better, because everybody now doesn't really is very pessimistic about those negotiations. Even if they went better, even if more radical things were done, there's a way in which that we are radically cut from um, the historical trajectory that our ancestors were on before the colonial encounter. And even if we try to establish new ways of being nationally, that won't take us back to where we were. Colonialism will always have already happened, and it will always, in some sense, have implications on the way that things are, even as we undermine it in the way we go forward. The fact that we act to undermine it still reacts to it as something that happened. And in some sense, even in the negative, it has a staying power. Even if it's as something we continually negate, the fact that we're still reacting to it shows that something about it is permanent. So in that article, Justice for the Dead,
Mhm.
it's in part a mourning of the irreparability of the loss that this encounter has, and in part a way to say, but can we still hope, even if we can't change the past, even if we can't extricate ourselves from the past, can we still hope? And I think for that article the answer is yes. And what we hope for is not the undoing of the damage done, but we hope for new time, for messianic time, something new, the event, if we can call it that.
No, I think I concur with you there, Sindika. I mean, you take a drive around South Africa, you can see all these irreparable damages that I think will take a long time to actually rectify some of those past injustices that we kind of endured to this point. And yeah, it's kind of frightening that a lot of people are kind of hopeful that things may change in the near future. But I mean, you and I are probably reading maybe not so much the same things, but almost similar things that kind of resonate with that whole notion of not slipping in despair, but being a little bit hopeless about the past, but
Yeah,
knowing that we're doing our best to maybe shift the tick on the clock, that we make a slight difference. But it's going to take a lifetime to dismantle some of these um, systems that were put there for thousands of years. We can't turn them, dismantle them overnight. It takes time. That's if we are able to even dismantle these
yeah,
systems of oppression that have been built around,
yeah,
particularly people of color. Now, you penned an article with a colleague of yours. I think it's Professor C. Van Gaard, if I'm saying it correctly. And you talk about this whole notion of a kind of social theology, for the sake of humanity. And you reflect on this metamodernism that you touched on initially. So, how can these principles of metamodernism enrich our discourse in Black liberation theology, particularly in our context?
That's a tough question. But okay, maybe before I even try to take a jab at the question, just for background, with that, so that article, we were asked to, respond to the book, the Metamodernism, by someone called Jason Storm, whose academic background is in religious studies, but that book isn't really about religious studies. That book is really about this deadlock between modernism or modernity on the one hand and postmodernism on the other hand. And that book basically tries to to synthesize these two approaches in a sense, and it comes up and ends up falling into some version of a metamodernism, though I'm not sure that that's the best term he should have used for himself for other reasons, which I won't get into here. And so basically what that book is about, and this is where I think you'll see a connection to your question on Black theology and what that argument has. That book basically observes that in the West, what postmodernity does is it results in the disintegration of academic disciplines. There's this auto-critique of happening by scholars of particular disciplines within those disciplines that leads them to the point of saying, my word, my academic discipline is a sham because it is a product of modernity and maybe even of colonialism. So, for example, religious studies as a discipline is something that really takes off in the 17th century. And what happens is the term religion, as it came to be used in the sense that we understand it now, as a way of referring to people's faiths and all of that,
Right.
is actually something that was invented in the 17th century by basically Protestants. And there was really no such thing as religion in the modern sense of the term before that. And as a result, when these religious scholars went and tried to understand other religions as religions, they didn't in fact go and look at them objectively and understand them, but they, in a sense, unintentionally influenced those faiths and those religions to become religions and to start articulating themselves according to the conceptual models of late Enlightenment, early modernity Protestantism. So religion as a category is a fiction in a sense. So as soon as scholars of in the 20th century and 21st century started making that kind of argument, they were left in this state of crisis where, okay, if my discipline is a sham, then how can I still do religious studies? And then this sort of had a trickle-down effect to other disciplines in the humanity. And we think even in theology, where you'll find that people have this autocritical relationship with the disciplines they find themselves in. So coming to the question of then Black theology. So what we were doing in that article is we were looking at the South African context. Some of the things we observed is a lot of the people in the articles that we find in the South African context, in the post-1994 South African context, who engage Black theology, a lot of them don't. To some extent, it becomes difficult to discern what the theological input of their articles is. It seems that what they have to say is usually indistinguishable from what someone would say in the social sciences, for example. And then they'll say what they say and then say, yeah, what they said, but now in theology. And then, at least with me, I always wondered, can Black theologians make a substantial contribution to Black theology from theology, which is substantially theological, rather than, and I don't mean this critically, but rather than a baptizing of concepts that are actually not originally theological? Well, to cut a long story short, what we ended up with in that article is say, okay, but what are people doing, not just in Black theology, but in the humanities in South Africa anyway? And what a lot of people in the humanities seem to be doing in South Africa is they seem to be dealing with questions of rehumanization or humanization, questions of justice, et cetera, decolonization, decoloniality, all of that. And we were basically saying, well, theology in the light of that book by Jason Storm would have to think of itself as something that is more radically a part of the humanities. But what that means in the South African context is that theology will have to understand itself as theology, as basically a kind of social kind, as something that has a stake in the fate of what happens in this conversation about rehumanization in the humanities. So it's very difficult to summarize that article, but I think that's probably what I'd say. And what that does for Black theology, and maybe this is the more important comment, then what that does for Black theology is, for at least this was my feeling. I think also, yes, also my colleague also has the same feeling, but I think even beyond that article, I still take this with me, and I still want to explore it further. I think it poses certain questions about revelation, about theological assurance that the claims of Black theology will be actualized. We don't talk about this in that article, but I do want you to know that that was in the back of my head, and I just didn't know how to bring it into the article. But the question for me is, if theology is understood as a social kind, as something that, as a discourse that is pretty much like any other discourse in the human sciences, rather than as something special. Theology isn't something special that comes from above. Theology is a discourse in the humanities. Then, with Black theology in mind, what does that do to the claims for liberation that Black theology issues? Because if theology understands itself as something separate from the other human sciences, then it can say, insofar as our theology comes from above, we can be sure that our claims from liberation have this transhistorical, metaphysical substance and essence that guarantees that we're at the very least on the right side of history, or at best that our objectives will come about. But I think for me specifically, as someone who says, no, we don't have that assurance, yet we still have to do Black theology in some sense, how then do we make the claim of Black theology and strive for liberation without that transhistorical metaphysical assurance that what we think will win out, even if only on the question of what people will unanimously agree is the right side of history? So that's the question for me. How does Black theology continue to operate when it doesn't have its celestial insurance policy, or if it doesn't have its metaphysical grounding? How does it continue to operate as Black theology, but without metaphysics? That's perhaps my interest.
I think that's a profound way of putting it, and I think it's something that our viewers need to lean onto. That these are typical frameworks that we use to try and talk about our experience and what we think God may be doing in the world, but they're not certainly something that are absolutes. These are just frameworks that we use to actually interpret and decipher what we actually need to do in our time, which is it's a lot of work. People don't seem to think in that way. It's just a lot of work and a lot of thinking, and sometimes we get it wrong and sometimes we get it right. But it's something we cannot avoid to actually engage in, which I actually like as you bring out. There's something else that you have penned. It has to do with the Xhosa spiritual possession, offers us a particular different lens, I would say, in how we can see other things that happen in the world. And I'm not too sure to what extent do you link that to Black liberation theology, and how does that benefit us in terms of being resistant onto some other things that have happened to particularly the Xhosa folks that you talk about, and how that our identity in the post-colonial society today.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.
Okay, yes. That article is perhaps my the closest I've come in writing so far to more explicitly engaging um, Black nihilism. And
So sorry to pause you, Sileka. You
okay,
mentioned this black nihilism. Maybe for the benefit
okay,
of our audience who do not actually understand what you mean by black nihilism,
okay,
do you mind clarifying that?
okay. Yes. That. Thanks for pointing that out. So, concisely put, Black nihilism is a. Let me begin by talking about how the first time this term appears, it's used as an unfavorable term. When people like Cornel West used this term in the 90s, they're describing a sense of resignation that they identify amongst young African Americans who feel like the political cannot actually help them. The political structures of the American democracy are not actually going to help them, and they sort of have this pessimistic disposition, and they sort of give up on even trying to fix the world. Maybe I can compare that in the South African context with how it has been observed for a couple of years now that most young people who are eligible to vote don't vote. And by the way, the majority of those people are black young people. There's a sense in which they don't have a stake in the democratic project of South Africa. And so, black nihilism, as shifting now back to the US context, is something that is, I would say, the brainchild of someone named Kelvin Warren, who writes this book called Ontological Terror. And he says, agree with why should we agree with Cornel West and others who identify black nihilism as something pathological? Why should we assume black resignation, black pessimism towards the political is a pathology or a bad thing? Why not actually assume that it's something prophetic or something indicative or something diagnostic? Or something that at least indicates that we should chart a different path than the political. And so black nihilism basically argues that the problem with the political, which the young pessimistic black people intuitively arrive at, even if it's not even if conceptually they don't think that way, is that the political is unable to solve the problem of anti-blackness. And instead, anti-blackness just finds ways to reinvent itself, even within the political. So after the antebellum slavery period, after slavery is abolished, anti-blackness doesn't go away, but it reinvents itself. And you have the Jim Crow laws, et cetera, and that leads us to the civil rights era. But after the civil rights era, and after the civil rights movement wins out, anti-blackness doesn't go away. It reinvents itself. And Calvin Warren looks at the police killings, which still happen in the present, and says, why is it that the political hasn't been able to do away with the problem of anti-blackness? Perhaps the political itself, insofar as it is rooted in modernity, will always reinvent the problem of anti-blackness. And so Calvin Warren would say that to overcome anti-blackness would require an overcoming of modernity itself, of metaphysics, and of the political. It would require a political apostasy. So I guess in the article that we're talking about, it was my way of trying to say, well, when I look at the South African context, I grew up in the townships, and the sort of thing Calvin Warren talks about as black nihilism is something I myself saw every day growing up in the township. This notion of black resignation. I've already hinted at how most young black people in South Africa don't even vote. And those who register they don't even register to vote. And those who register to vote, a lot of them don't even vote, And how is that for a vote of no confidence on the democratic project? And so in that article, I basically say, however, there are spiritual practices that take place as ways of grappling and wrestling with the continuance of anti-blackness. So in that article, I trace it from the colonial period with the emergence of the spirit for possession phenomena of Amafufunyana. Then I go all the way to, the early democratic era, we're talking early 2000s, with the spirit possession phenomena of Amakhosi, and look at how these are spiritual practices. Because the thing with Amafufunyana and Amakhosi is it's not like demon possession in the Christian tradition. Demon possession in the Christian tradition is something that happens against your will. You never want to be demon possessed.
Yeah.
But Amafufunyana and Amakhosi are forms of spirit possession that people voluntarily undergo. People actually seek it out as a strategy of survival. So I look at that and say, why are people seeking out these interesting and strange spirit possession phenomena instead of going to the strategies of the democratic project? Why not go to political instruments that the South African democracy and the Constitution provide us in order to overcome anti-blackness? Why are these people going to those spiritual projects? And well, in that article, I basically say that's because maybe it's because there's an intuitive sense that the political cannot solve the problem of anti-blackness in South Africa. And so people are turning to spiritual practices as discourse by other means that are other than political. And I'm saying, insofar as those are spirit phenomena, theology should engage that. Black theology should engage that. So that was my flirtation with Calvin Warren's Black nihilism in a South African context.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Do you think a lot of our, democratic government, which tends to be black, is anti-black itself? Would you say that?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily. I would say yes and no. I wouldn't say. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily the case that there's an anti-black agenda in the ANC or something like that. That would border on being conspiratorial, or maybe even more than border. But even if there's no intentional agenda to be anti-black, the end result is anti-black. So I would say something a little bit different. I would say what I see is, even when the ANC wasn't failing like it is now, liberal democracy couldn't overcome the problem of anti-blackness. What we see, even in the ANC's best years, is not in any way a solution of the problem of anti-blackness. The townships don't shrink.
Of course,
yes,
they expand.
Exactly. There are more townships than there were. Anti-blackness just finds. Here's the thing that really knocks you off your chair. Really, apartheid learned to become democratic. That's what happened. In 1994, meaning the turn to liberal democracy just gave anti-blackness a new way to reformulate itself, rather than to put it on the back foot. And of course, there are ways in which anti-blackness plays itself out in ways that are substantially different. For example, there are no laws that enforce anti-blackness. Yet, it's funny how there are things that were kept up through laws of legislation. For example, having residential areas which are strictly for white people. And now those things are no longer upheld by laws, but are upheld by things like finance and financial regulations. So we still have segregated living without any legislation that enforces it. That tells you that anti-blackness learned to function democratically, even if it needed to include some black people who are more privileged, like myself, perhaps, to live in these certain spaces. Anti-blackness can still survive in a liberal democracy. So no, I don't. Yes and no is the answer to your question from me. Yes, in the end result, whether they intend to or not, what we get is anti-blackness.
Okay, yeah, I think it's well put. Because I'm of the same view that, the systems of oppression get to a point where they can basically become autonomous. They just run themselves and reinvent themselves into something else, as you also put it. So sometimes it's very difficult to kind of navigate what is it that you are actually dealing with, because it's constantly evolving. Yeah, which is something incredible. That we're always chasing it, and and I guess our work is cut out to try and nip this beast. But obviously, it's very difficult to actually nip it and kill it. But now I want to ask you. You've obviously contributed a lot in the theological space in your very limited, time that you have been in the academy. But now I want to ask you, what are some of the practical steps that you think religious communities in South Africa can take to embody the principles of liberation theology in its essence?
Sure, that's a tough question. Let me see. Part of me is tempted to give a pessimistic answer, and it'll sound dismissive and crass, but it isn't. And that pessimistic answer is nothing. There's nothing they can do to embody. Not that there's nothing they can do, but there's nothing that they will do to it. Maybe I'm speaking mostly from my religious community. Maybe there are others that can, and in fact, there are others that maybe can better do things. But that's the crass answer. But but at the same time, I'm also tempted not to be so dismissive and pessimistic. And before I try to, I'll try to end it on a hopeful note. But let's linger a little bit on the pessimism before we get to the.
Yeah, so you can tell me why. I'm interested in knowing why you say your tradition. You don't see any hope in that in them doing anything meaningful whatsoever.
Yes, I think this goes back to what I said in the beginning about how insofar as my own tradition, which is the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is implicated in modernity, it can't, even if it can intentionally try to, it can't really overcome, or it can't really liberate from anti-blackness. And that's not just an indictment, by the way, to my mind, of Adventism. I think that's also my pushback to even black theology. To some extent, I don't think even black theology can do it, because it itself is implicated in modernity. But maybe let's bracket that for now. Let's just keep it to the faith communities. Specifically, why I say this is there are deep doctrinal commitments, deep theological commitments to particular theological beliefs, which those same beliefs are deeply tied to modernity, and trying to live out a liberatory praxis or a liberatory way of being a community as a church would require a renouncing of some of those doctrinal positions. But the problem is those doctrinal positions can't, once those are renounced, then the community no longer exists as what it is. It can't. Then that's the end of what we know Seventh-day Adventism to be. So there's this catch-22. Do I hold on to what I am and always have been born as? My father was this Seventh-day Adventist. I believe in it, read the Bible and all of that, and come to these conclusions. Well, if I hold on to that, then how do I deal with this problem of anti-blackness? Well, then on the flip side of it, and I think that's why a lot of people who are very faithful to Seventh-day Adventism ignore the questions of race, because paying too much attention to that question will eventually call the theological commitment into question. But on the flip side of that, a lot of people I know personally who dive into the question of race, a lot of them end up having a fractured relationship with the church, even if it's internal, like in terms of their beliefs, So there are such beliefs. I mean, central beliefs like belief in literal interpretation of the Bible, for example. Such beliefs as that it's not necessarily about the text of the Bible itself, but the doctrinal position with respect to the text of the Bible, which is itself a very modernist way of reading the Bible.
Yeah, of reading the text, yeah.
If you read the Bible that way, you can't. What do you do with those texts in the Bible, which, even when correctly interpreted, reinscribe oppression? For example, texts in the Bible that talk about slavery are not misunderstood. They mean exactly what they say. Texts in the Bible that are homophobic are not misunderstood. They are homophobic, even when you have the best exegesis. Texts in the Bible that are, etc., etc. And there's no way to have that theological doctrinal commitment and at the same time have a commitment to liberation, which brings these two things into contradiction without having to choose, even if only on those points of contradiction. But the problem is those points of contradiction have massive implications in terms of what you are as an identity. So when you make those kind of changes within a community like mine, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you could actually be shunned, maybe not officially disfellowshipped or anything like that. That's not a thing that's really done so much anymore. That's not a thing that's done anymore in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Maybe you won't even be removed from membership, but how do you belong to the community the way you did before you said certain things after you say them? You can't. So that's where the pessimism comes from. We'd have to ask questions like, why do we have a general conference? Why do we have conferences? Why do we have unions? Why isn't the local church the authority that the church manual claims it is? Why aren't things being thought about from the local context, just as we claim? Why do we tithe and our tithes go all the way up? Something that you've once bravely raised in a church, something I would never do, by the way. But you ask those questions, and then there's also not that if everything was situated in the local context, things would be better, because like I said, there's the question of the theological commitments, so in fact, a lot of the time the local church is less willing to make changes, even changes considered progressive, than the formal structures. For example, I pastored in the Eastern Cape for 4 years, and I was shocked to discover how reluctant many of those churches were to ordain women as elders, even though the church, the formal structures of the church have already thumbed up the ordination of women as elders. And so sometimes the local church isn't necessarily going to be more akin or attuned to liberatory ways of being a community, So that was a lot that I threw at you, but that's basically my way of saying two things. One is there are theological commitments you're going to be brought into confrontation with that you might, that the only way to actualize certain liberation would require maybe you even renounce. But then how do you renounce that and still be a Seventh-day Adventist? So that's the conundrum for Seventh-day Adventists.
Yeah, that's the conundrum. I think people tend to misunderstand that there's beauty in each tradition. I mean, we basically come from the same background, and there's beauty in that, but there's also some problematic things with the tradition that we kind of belong to, and it causes problems for us. You and I are in the academy as much as we're also in the church, so we're not just reading the Bible, we're also thinking about what we're reading in the Bible and how it plays out in the public, and sometimes it doesn't play out so nicely, and you are constantly caught up in this conundrum, which you actually, as you mentioned earlier, that you become fractured as a believer, but to navigate between those two sometimes is very it's a challenge. But if you understand that there's beauty in each tradition that we bring, and there's also things that are problematic to the tradition, then I think it helps us to kind of move forward without totally disregarding some things as if they're not actually happening, in like the issue of race that you're talking about, the issues of women ordination, if it's a thing. I mean, our churches are pretty much 80% women membership in our churches, but most of the leadership goes to men, and which is absurd to actually think about it in 2024 that we're still talking about such things. But we understand that a lot of these things are not necessarily coming from the bottom up, they're coming from the top down, which causes a lot of problems for us. But now, what I want to ask you, Silk, is you've said a lot, in that last few minutes or so. What are the challenges, though, in South Africa specifically to implement some of these tenets of Black liberation theology, and what are some of the opportunities? Because these opportunities, but you said earlier that you cannot are quite pessimistic about itself. So how do we now play or navigate these two seemingly apparent contradiction?
So, what are the challenges? So, I think there are a few. One is, I think, a challenge with the state of Black theology in South Africa. So I know that some have said, there was one famous book in 2006 that basically was, for all intents and purposes, putting itself forward as an obituary to Black theology, saying that Black theology is dead, in South Africa. But I think that's extreme. I don't think Black theology in South Africa is dead, but I don't think it's in a very good state at the same time. There are definitely people who have been contributing to Black theology, but so one of the challenges to Black theology, in terms of it just making its case and in a way that is compelling to people, is the state of the written literature of Black theology, for example. It's not enough. We don't have enough. And what we have is substantially in the form of journal articles instead of books. There are some books. People like Alan Busak. Alan Busak has a book that came out, I believe, right at the beginning of lockdown, and I think he's got another one coming out like this year or something.
Yeah, there was one in 21 that he published in 21. I think it's
yes,
Revolutionaries or something.
I can't remember the title, but I know that it had something to do with it had something about water in the title, the waters of what is it? Anyway, but I know that it was about saying, how about we shift away from this Moses/Aaron tradition in the Bible and look at the Miriam tradition as a source for Black theology. Yeah, we leaned too heavily in the Exodus tradition in the 80s or that time. How about we also look at the Miriam tradition? That's the kind of argument he's making in that book. But anyway, my point is that the state of Black theology itself isn't as good as it is in the US context or even in the UK context, where I think that has to do with the academic environment in South Africa. What I've discovered, I'm new to this, and I don't even have a permanent job or anything like that, and I'm new to the stuff. But what I can already see is there's little to no incentive to write books as an academic in a South African university. The university incentivizes the writing of articles, but it's very difficult to. You might find that you have to have a lot of resolve and a lot of inner strength to push against the grain and publish a book, and as a result, I'm sure that contributes to the lack of publications of books in Black theology, which means if most of your substantial contributions are in the form of articles, an article is far too brief to leave an index mark and to develop a discourse and to develop a conversation. So the state of Black theology itself is one of the challenges to the implication of the stuff. The other challenge is, notwithstanding how Black theology isn't as developed as it can be in the post-1994 era, notwithstanding that problem, there's also the problem of people don't really find Black theology compelling at the ground level. And a lot of people think that's because, oh no, that's a shift that took place in 1994. But that's not really the case. Church folk have never really found Black theology compelling, even during apartheid. Even during apartheid, people who were really into Black theology were sort of scorned, were sort of, that's, church folk don't really find Black theology compelling, which is shocking because they do find Black consciousness compelling. And I suspect, I can't prove this, but I suspect that the momentum Black theology had in the pre-1994 era was really riding the wave of Black consciousness, I suspect, more than riding its own wave. And that's because Black consciousness itself heavily invests in the project of Black consciousness Black theology as a vehicle of conscientizing Black people living under apartheid. But it just doesn't seem that it's something that got really taken up at grassroots level. It did become a very middle class Black conversation because the people who kept it alive, even during apartheid, were employed in the universities, and they kept it alive in the form of writing PhDs, which then were converted into books, publishing journal articles. Who's reading journal articles? Not Black
they don't read them.
Yeah. So that's the second challenge. So the first challenge is the state of Black theology itself. The other challenge is people not really finding it compelling, So those are probably one of the, and then the other one is Black theology is also sort of muted. Black theology is also sort of written out. You and I went through an undergrad curriculum which said nothing about Black theology. People can be educated theologically and not even be introduced to this school of thought. Well, and that in and of itself means that you have this large amount of people who have theology degrees and are serving as pastors who don't know what Black theology is.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, so there's that. So those are probably the three things I can think of. I think.
I'm saying you raised something quite important that someone will go through a seminary training without reading a Black author in the field, in theology, and what many of us probably would have encountered would have been a footnote of maybe a James Cone or Roberts or King. We've never even read King. Quite an instrumental figure in the Black social gospel, which later became liberation theology. I'm of the view that King was a liberation theologian, even though it was not explicitly stated as that. I mean, Cone uses that word. His work led some sort of a liberation theology, and he uses King and Malcolm X as these figures that he constructs liberation theology. But tell me now, so before I let you go, and I see our time is running out, do you think there's this big dichotomy between the academy and the church? Because church folks tend to kind of view academics with a little bit of suspicion, as if you bringing something to disrupt maybe their faith. And also I read somewhere that particularly in the US context, that a lot of people there were following a liberation theology, maybe not necessarily as a liberation theology, but more of a Black social gospel. And when the tides kind of changed, you had a lot of poor and oppressed people that kind of moved away from the Black church, and not necessarily the Black church, but the Black liberation church, to follow a more of a Pentecostal movement, which talks to their individualistic approach. Because we have a lot of boom here in South Africa, where we have prophets that are coming up and saying, "Come, I can make you rich, and come, I can sort out all the problems we have." And we see there's more and more of an appeal to that, instead of dealing with more problems of the society at a larger scale. People are more concerned about just me, myself, and I. I want my relationship with my God. That's it. So, what is your take on that? Before I let you.
So before I even answer or give my response to your question, which is, just remind me what was the question again? The question. Do I think there's a chasm between the academy and the church. Before I even answer that, just to riff on the last thing you said there, the funny thing I've noticed is, at least in the circles that I move in, a lot of the people who ideologically will subscribe to revolutionary politics, they'll be in the EFF, or they'll be proponents of Black consciousness, what have you, just don't make that connection spiritually as well. I remember one place where I was pastoring, the first place I was pastoring, I had a very devoted church member in one of my churches, who was a very involved member of the EFF, but he can talk about land redistribution with expropriation without compensation, all that stuff from in the political register. But once he shifts registers to the religious, the two just wouldn't come together. He just wouldn't use theological or religious language that way. He'd keep the two separate, and I guess we know why in the SDA context, because there's that separation of church and politics thing. But anyway, to come to your actual question, is there a gap or a chasm between the academy and actual religious communities? Yes and no. To the extent to which the answer is no, it is that, let's say, particularly with the theological part of the university, the people who go and study theology and at that study it all the way up to PhD, postgrad level, are people who are usually deeply committed to their churches, and in fact, it's some of them they get financial backing from their churches and financial sponsorship from their churches to study. And when you read, most of the people who are publishing currently and publishing about Black theology are in one way or another in the church that I know.
Certainly,
those that I meet at academic conferences, a lot of them are ordained ministers. So to some extent, no, there isn't, but to some extent, yes, there is. And this is perhaps the spirit of your question, the part where there is indeed a gap, which is, as you mentioned, the church can feel threatened by some of the things that academics say. I think that's probably, to a large extent, our experience in our church. And I think to some extent, that is as it should be, because of how I understand the role of an academic. The role of an academic as someone who thinks and probes questions. The academic should hold up a mirror and show the church what they are. And the church won't always like what the church looks like in terms of the picture that's painted by the academic. But I still think, to the extent that it's a bad thing that there's a gap, the academics shouldn't divorce themselves from the people, in my opinion.
Definitely.
The academics should still be situated where the people are, but not as someone who's going to tell the people what they want to hear. At the same time, not as someone who's going to have this obsession with disturbing and unsettling the community. But so there's that. There's this dual role of affirming what is good and pointing out what isn't. So there is a gap. Definitely. There is a gap. I think also besides that, in terms of how disturbing or whatever the academic can be, there is also a gap just in terms of the way you do theology in different spheres of society. The way you do theology in a church and the way you do theology in the university differ. In the church, you do theology by worship, by reading the Bible, by preaching, etc., etc., etc. But the way you do theology in the academy is more through reading, through writing, through publishing, through presenting papers. These are completely different grammars, completely different registers. Even the same person can advance the same theological position using completely different language and even completely different strategies in these two different spheres. So that does create a semblance of a gap, but at the same time, these two sort of exist on top of each other. They can't. There are no walls that you can really erect to sharply separate them. So they do sort of bleed into each other at the same time.
Yeah, I think you've put it well. Maybe as a final question, as I let you go, what do you think in terms of research areas in liberation theology are critical in terms of its advancement in South Africa as we hedge ahead?
Okay, so let me start with what's already happening, and that is, I think the biggest turn now is the decolonial turn, particularly in terms of an engagement with decolonial theory, decoloniality. So that shift has, I think, led to the questioning of sources of doing theology, etc. It's questions of standpoint. Where are you doing theology from, etc., etc., etc. So that's perhaps one of the most obvious, because that's the one that's already happening. But maybe another one is on the question of, I think, the question of the traditional ways of doing theology as well, the traditional doctrinal loci, like Christology, doctrine of creation. Those have kind of not been, those are still there, but they're not, they've kind of taken a backseat, especially if you compare contemporary Black theology in South Africa with pre-1994 Black theology in South Africa. I mean, people like Takatso Mofokeng were writing Black Christologies. I don't think I can think of anyone who's writing a Black Christology now, you know. So, or people like Simon Maimela were writing theological anthropology, a Black theological anthropology. You know, I can't think of anybody who's doing it quite like that, engaging the traditional doctrinal loci of systematic theology. You know, the doctrine of creation, doctrine of salvation, doctrine of Christology, eschatology, or ecclesiology. But, okay, so that's the second thing. But the third thing I would say is, I also think something we need to, I don't know if anybody's really posing the question, but something we need to look into is there perhaps a need to fundamentally change the way we do Black theology? Is there perhaps a coming species of Black theologians and a coming form of Black theology, which might not even look like anything we've ever called Black theology before? You know, how does the way we say the same thing change when the problem space shifts as it has, as we move from the 20th century to the 21st century? I think a lot of people are still trying to redo the sort of thing Black theology had going for it in the 80s. But we must remember the kind of world that was. That was a world during the Cold War, for example. The Cold War was still going on. People were wondering, is it going to be capitalism or is it going to be socialism that wins out? Things like that. But what happens how does Black theology do Black theology after the so-called end of history? And those who, in case you don't know what I'm referring to when I talk about the end of history, Francis Fukuyama published this famous essay titled "End of History?" when it became clear that the Soviet Union wasn't going to work out and was going to collapse. And then later, when the Soviet Union actually collapsed, he expands that to the form of a book, "The End of History." The question mark disappears. End of history, and a new man. You know, and he's basically arguing in that book that nope, socialism lost. We've reached the end of history. The dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic, has given us liberal democracy and capitalism. And well, how we can't reinvent articulations of Black theology which spoke to a context that was, while it was undecided which way things would go globally. We're not even talking about how things would go locally. And the question needs to be asked, is it possible that part of the reason Black theology has had a little bit of a lull, a little bit of a wilderness period, post 1994, is because we're still probably trying to turn the wheels the way that they turned in a world before the so-called end of history. And by the way, I think Francis Fukuyama was talking absolute rubbish. I don't think there was ever any end of history. But in any case, that's the consensus, at least that we find ourselves in. So those three things would probably be my observation on what would be important to look into as we get into Black theology moving forward.
Fantastic, Silake. I mean, it's been great to have you here, and the insights you've shared. It's amazing that we do Black theology. You kind of teach here, and I teach on the other side of the ocean, but we pretty much are seeing the same things. From both contexts, they may be slightly different, but we are confronted more or less with the same things. And I thank you for that, for your insights and your contribution in the scholarship. So I really appreciate it, and much so in the church as well. I think we people in the academy are much more needed in the church now, because our young folks are asking a lot of difficult questions, which need to be addressed. We cannot shy away from those questions. I think there's something good happening, and at the same time there's some bad things that are happening, but perhaps we can pick it up in our next conversation as we engage furthermore in these discussions. Before I say goodbye to you, are you doing anything in the pipeline that you are working on that you are probably our audience can look forward to, and even push some of them to read some of the stuff that you have? Do you have some kind of online presence or something that you're working on in the pipeline we can look forward to?
Okay. Yeah, I don't have much of an online presence. I do have a YouTube channel, but I haven't contributed to that YouTube channel, I think, since last year, or maybe even the year before. I don't even remember. But in terms of the pipeline, currently just really working on my PhD. I'm pretty sure that as I keep going, some publications will come out of that as well. Currently, I can't say there's anything about to come out. I am working on stuff. The way it is with manuscripts for journal publication is, I'll work on something, write something, and it'll turn out that it's not what I thought it was. It's really going to work as a part of my thesis, and not so much as an article. And other times it works out. So it's too early to say if the things I'm writing are going to appear as an article, at least the article I think I'm writing. But there are things I'm working on. There are things I'm writing. The thing that I can definitely say is I'm working on my PhD.
Fantastic. I think it's we're all in the same boat. We're all being kept awake with PhD. Sometimes we wonder why we signed up for it, but at least I do.
Tell me about
it's fulfilling it. You go ahead and you see the type of progress that one has made. Certainly, Silake, thank you very much for taking this time to converse with us. And I certainly,
yes,
at home have enjoyed our conversation. And until next time at home, keep tuning in and for these awesome live conversations. And Silake, until next time, goodbye.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.